She said it so softly the horses almost breathed over it. "I can't take more than 3 steps in." Wyatt Hale stood at the barn door with a kerosene lantern hanging low from his hand, its light trembling across the floorboards, the feed bins, the dust that drifted through the air like old ash. And for a moment he thought the woman was talking about pain, or cold, or the blood darkening the cuff of her sleeve. But there was something in her voice that did not belong to any simple wound. It was the voice of someone measuring a place against a memory and finding the memory heavier. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the cottonwoods behind the ranch house and carried in the smell of dry earth, horse sweat, and rain that had not yet arrived. Inside the barn, everything felt close and hollow at the same time. A mare shifted in her stall. Leather tack creaked on its peg. Somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon stirred and went still again. Wyatt did not step toward her. He had grown up around frightened animals and proud people, and he knew they shared one rule: crowd either one, and you lost them. The woman stood just beyond the spill of lantern light, slim and straight despite the limp in her right leg, her dark braid fallen over one shoulder, her face turned not toward him but toward the black reach of the barn behind him, as if that darkness had a face of its own. He had found her near the east fence less than 20 minutes earlier, half hidden in sage and shadow, one hand pressed to her side, her eyes clear enough to refuse help even while her knees gave under her. She had let him bring her this far because the night was turning cold, and because pride, no matter how strong, could not warm a person after sundown on open land. But now the threshold held her like a line drawn by somebody long dead. Wyatt lifted the lantern an inch, no more. The light caught the corner of her cheek, the dust on her boots, the silver bead sewn into the edge of her shawl. Apache, he thought, though she had not said so, and the thought came with all the old silence this country liked to wrap around things it did not understand. "You can stay by the door," he said. His voice came out low, careful, the kind a man used when he did not want to make the wrong sound in the wrong hour. She looked at him then, and what struck him was not fear. It was calculation, not whether he meant harm, but whether this place did. Her gaze dropped to the floorboards. 1 step, 2, 3. She did not move. Wyatt followed the line of her eyes and saw nothing there but worn wood, a scatter of straw, and the long, thin shadow of a stall post laid across the ground like a mark someone had left on purpose. Behind him, the barn seemed to deepen, every corner holding back a secret it had kept too long. Then the woman drew one shallow breath, steadied herself against the doorframe, and whispered, almost to the dark itself, "Not past that." Wyatt kept the lantern low and set it on an overturned bucket near the door, close enough to give light, far enough not to crowd her. The flame made the metal chimney glow amber, and that small circle of brightness settled over the barn like a promise that did not yet know whether it could be kept. He reached for the water pail hanging by the tack wall, found it half full and cold from the well, then poured some into a dented tin cup without taking his eyes off the woman for more than a second at a time. She had not moved. Her hand still rested against the doorframe, fingers tense, her breathing careful, as if even the air in that place had to be measured before it entered her lungs. Wyatt came no closer than an arm's length from the lantern and set the cup on the floorboards where the light touched the edge of it. "You do not have to trust me," he said. "You only have to decide whether the night is worse." For the first time, something in her face shifted. Not softness, not relief, just the faintest sign that she had heard a sentence she could use. Outside, the wind pressed against the barn siding and eased again. From the house uphill, a thin line of lamplight showed through the kitchen window. Beyond that, the pasture ran silver under a rising moon, and the fence posts looked like dark men standing watch. Across the land, the woman glanced over her shoulder toward the open yard, weighing distance, cold, and pride in one silent reckoning. Then she took one step inside. The board beneath her boot gave a low groan. She stopped. She took a second. Dust lifted around the hem of her skirt. Then the third. At once her whole body locked, as if some invisible wire had pulled tight from the past straight into the center of her chest. Wyatt saw it happen and did not mistake it now for ordinary fear. This was memory laid over wood and shadow until the two became one thing. He wanted to tell her there was nothing there, but a man learned early that saying a thing did not always make it true for the person who had to carry it. So he said nothing. The mare in the nearest stall lowered her head over the rail and blew warm air into the dark. The woman looked at the horse, and for a brief moment her shoulders dropped. Only a little, but enough for Wyatt to see that some part of her still belonged to the living world. She bent, picked up the tin cup, and drank with slow care. Her hand trembled only once. When she lowered the cup again, a single bead of water caught the lantern light and slid down across her knuckle like quicksilver. "There is hay in the loft," Wyatt said. "Blankets in the house. Coffee, too, if you can stand it black." She gave the smallest shake of her head. "No house." Her voice was steadier now, but thin from weariness. "No closed rooms." Wyatt nodded as if that made plain sense. In truth, it told him more than any long explanation could have. Whatever had happened to her, walls had been part of it. Roofs, doorways, the kind of shelter most folks thanked God for every winter night. He leaned one shoulder against a post near the entrance and let the silence rest between them without trying to fill it. After a while she looked down at her sleeve where the fabric had torn. Not a bad wound, he thought. A scrape, maybe a bruise beneath it, enough to sting, enough to slow a person over rough country. He had seen worse from barbed wire and stubborn horses. Still, exhaustion could lay a body lower than injury, if it had ridden long enough. "What do I call you?" he asked. She did not answer right away. Her eyes moved across the barn, not searching now, but checking, the way a traveler checked the sky for weather signs already understood. At last she said, "Elira." The name settled into the air with a quiet weight. "Wyatt," he said. "I know," she replied. That landed harder than it should have. He straightened from the post. "You know me. I know this ranch." She let her gaze drift beyond him into the dark shape of the stalls, the hanging bridles, the old wagon wheel propped in the corner. "Or I knew it once, when I was small enough to be carried." Wyatt said nothing, but the words moved through him like cold well water. This land had been his father's before it became his, and before that it had been little more than open ground, a creek line, a weather-beaten barn, and a stubborn claim no banker would have wanted. Folks passing through remembered the place. Cattle buyers, drifters, families in wagons, men who came honest and men who did not. But there was something in the way Elira said it that was not passing memory. It was older than directions and deeper than landmarks. From outside came the crunch of boots over gravel. Both of them heard it at the same time. Wyatt turned toward the door just as the shadow of a young ranch hand crossed the threshold. It was Owen Mercer, 17 years old, all elbows and worry, carrying a coil of rope he no longer seemed to remember holding. He stopped dead when he saw Elira half in shadow, Wyatt by the door, and the lantern burning between them. His eyes moved once from Wyatt to the woman and back again. No one spoke. In the barn, silence could shape itself into almost any story, and Wyatt felt the first bad turn of the night arrive before a single word had been said. Owen Mercer stood in the doorway as if the whole barn had shifted under him. He was a good boy, sharp with horses, eager with fences, and far too young to understand how quickly a half-seen moment could outrun the truth. The coil of rope hung loose from his hand. His hat sat crooked from work, and the moon behind him drew a pale line around his shoulders so that for 1 second he looked less like a ranch hand and more like some witness the night had sent on purpose. Wyatt saw the question form in the boy's face before he heard the words. "I was just putting up the bay mare," Owen said, though nobody had asked. His voice came out dry and wrong. Elira lowered the tin cup, but did not step back. Wyatt could feel the shape of the scene from where Owen stood, a woman tired and hurt, a closed barn, a lantern between shadows, and a man known well enough in the county that people thought they already understood him. Most trouble did not begin with evil. Most of it began with somebody deciding too fast what they had seen. She needed shelter from the cold, Wyatt said. He kept his tone even, the same tone he would have used to discuss rain, feed, or a lame horse. Owen nodded too quickly, eyes darting to Elira, then to the floorboards where the lantern threw long shadows across the stalls. He noticed the cup. He noticed the dark mark on her sleeve. He noticed, most of all, that she stood only 3 steps in and no farther, her body held tight with a caution he did not know how to read. "Of course," he said, but the words had no weight in them. Elira watched him with a stillness that made Wyatt uneasy. She seemed to know at once what kind of danger this was. Not a hand raised, not a weapon drawn. something older and meaner in its own quiet way. A story told wrong, and then told again. Owen shifted his boots against the packed dirt at the threshold. Mrs. Mercer was asking if you were coming up to the house, he said. She said supper is going cold. Wyatt almost told him he would be there soon, but he saw the boy's fingers tighten around the rope and understood that Owen had already begun carrying what he thought he had witnessed. It was there in the way he would not look straight at Wyatt now. It was there in the way he gave Elira one brief, uncertain glance, the kind a person gave when they wanted to ask if they should help, but did not yet know whom to fear. Go on up, Wyatt said. I will tend to things here. The boy swallowed. Yes, sir. But he did not move at once. His gaze caught on the line in the floor where Elira had stopped, then on the old stall post throwing its narrow shadow. Something about the place unsettled him too, though he would never have been able to name it. At last he backed away, boots scraping over the threshold, and disappeared into the moonlit yard. Wyatt listened to his steps fade toward the house, then angle not to the porch but toward the bunk shed first. That small turn in the sound told him enough. By morning the wrong version of this night would be ahead of the sun. He let out a breath through his nose and looked toward Elira. He is young, he said. Young men grow into older men who tell the same tale louder, she answered. Her eyes had gone back to the dark reach of the barn, but her words landed clean. Wyatt could not argue. The county had been built as much by talk as by timber. Reputations were nailed up faster than boards, and once the weather got to them, they warped in ways no honest hand could fully straighten. Elira set the cup down near the lantern and shifted her weight off her injured leg. Wyatt saw her wince, slight and quickly hidden, but enough to remind him that the night was not waiting for either of them to sort out the county's habits. He glanced toward the tack wall where an old wool blanket hung folded over a peg. I can bring that to you, he said. You will not have to go farther in. She looked at the blanket, then at him, measuring the offer the way she had measured the threshold. Leave it there, she said. He did. When he stepped back, the lantern light brushed the edge of her shawl, and something small loosened from the seam and fell soundlessly to the floor. Neither of them noticed at first. Wyatt had turned his head toward the yard again, listening now for voices from the bunk shed, and Elira had closed her eyes for the span of one weary breath. From the house above the barn came a door opening and the distant murmur of women speaking low over dishes and stove heat. Then another sound rose beneath it, fainter, and more troubling because of how ordinary it was. A laugh cut short, followed by the hush that always came when a private thought became public. Owen had started talking. Wyatt felt it in his chest before he fully heard it. Not the words themselves, the shape of them. Surprise first, then concern dressed up as certainty. The kind of concern that traveled fast because it let people feel righteous on the way. He stepped toward the doorway and looked out across the yard. Light glowed from the bunk shed window now, too bright for bedtime. A second figure crossed in front of it, then a third. He had seen storm clouds gather slower over open country. Behind him, Elira bent to reach for the blanket and her hand brushed the object that had fallen from her shawl. She paused. Wyatt turned at the sound of the faint scrape against wood. In her palm lay a small silver button wrapped with faded red thread, worn smooth by years and handling. The moment his eyes found it, the air in the barn changed. He knew that button, not by where he had seen it, not yet, but by the sharp, impossible certainty that some part of his life had been waiting in silence for it to appear. Elira did not close her fingers around the silver button right away. She held it in her open palm as if it might change shape under the lantern light and become something easier to explain. It was no bigger than $50, worn dull at the edges, with a shallow stamped pattern nearly rubbed smooth by time, and the red thread wrapped through its shank had faded to the color of old brick. Wyatt stared at it with that strange feeling a man got when memory arrived before sense did. He knew the object, not from any story often told, but from one of those quiet corners of a house where a child noticed what grown folks never meant to discuss. He had seen it years ago in a cedar box on the top shelf of his father's room, tucked beside a broken watch chain, 2 army buttons, and a folded paper no one was supposed to touch. Back then it had meant nothing to him except that it did not belong with the rest. Now, seeing it in Elira's hand, it seemed to pull the whole night tighter. Where did you get that? He asked. His voice was lower than before, not with anger, but with the careful weight of a man stepping onto uncertain ground. Elira looked up at him, her dark eyes steady, measuring whether the question came from accusation or recognition. "It was sewn inside my mother's shawl," she said. "She told me never to lose it." Wyatt felt something shift behind his ribs. He could almost smell the cedar from that old box, could see his father standing at the washstand years ago, broad shoulders bent, not looking at anyone while he buttoned his shirt. There had been evenings, not many but enough, when the older man had gone silent for no visible reason, as if a door had opened in his mind and let in weather from another season. Wyatt had never understood it then. Boys thought silence in men was natural, like dust on boots or wind against a fence. Only later did he begin to wonder what kind of memory could live so long in a person without speaking its own name. Elira turned the button once between thumb and forefinger, and the lantern flame found the faint old pattern pressed into the silver. "You have seen it before," she said. It was not a question. Wyatt nodded slowly. "In my father's room. Years back." Elira's gaze did not move from his face. "Then your father knew something." The words settled between them with more force than if she had raised her voice. Outside, the ranch had grown louder in the careful way night places did when talk started to spread. A door opened near the bunk shed. Boots crossed the yard. Someone called Owen's name and got a hushed answer. Wyatt could almost hear the story taking shape out there, growing neat and ugly as it passed from one mouth to another. But inside the barn another story had opened, and it reached farther back than anything the bunkhouse men could guess. He crouched near the lantern and looked again at the floor where Elira had stopped. 3 boards in, just past the threshold, a nail head caught the light. Beside it ran a shallow scratch in the wood, old and straight, too deliberate to be from a horseshoe or dragged tack. He had walked over that spot 1,000 times without truly seeing it. Now it seemed less like damage and more like a mark left by someone trying to remember where something had happened. He stood again and looked toward the far stall, the oldest one in the barn, the one his father had never used for horses after Wyatt was old enough to notice. He had always thought it was because the roof leaked in one corner and the boards there were warped by age. Tonight that explanation felt thin as paper. Elira saw where his eyes had gone. Her own expression changed, not into fear exactly, but into the rigid calm of someone standing near a wound long scarred over and suddenly aware it might open if touched. "When I was little," she said, "I remembered a barn before I remembered a face. The smell of wet hay, a lantern too low, a line on the floor, my mother counting under her breath." Wyatt did not speak. He knew enough now to let a person choose which piece of memory to hand over and which to keep. The mare in the stall exhaled softly and stamped once. Somewhere above them in the loft, wood settled with a tired creak. Elira looked at the silver button again, then closed her hand around it at last. "I did not come here looking for shelter," she said. The words were plain. No edge, no drama. That made them hit harder. Wyatt felt the truth of it before he understood its full size. He had found her near the east fence because she had meant to be found there, or near enough. The scrape on her sleeve, the weary limp, the silence at the threshold, none of it had been false, but it had not been the whole of her purpose either. "You came for this ranch," he said. "I came because this is where the trail ended," she answered. "My mother died with very little left that she would speak aloud. A place, 3 boards from the door, a silver button, a man who once chose not to look away." Wyatt heard his father in that sentence, though the old man had been dead 6 years and buried on the low hill beyond the cottonwoods. Chose not to look away. It sounded like him in a way the county had never noticed. Folks remembered sternness, long workdays, fair prices, and hard winters. They did not remember the private choices, the ones that cost a man sleep and left strange keepsakes hidden in cedar boxes. From the yard came the unmistakable sound of more than one person approaching now, their steps slower than Owen's had been, more deliberate. Wyatt glanced toward the barn door. Lantern light from the house shone wider across the slope, and shadows moved in it. The night was no longer theirs alone. Elira followed his gaze, then looked back at him with a calm that had sharpened into purpose. "When they speak," she said, "they will speak as if they know what happened in here." Wyatt nodded once. "They will be wrong." "Yes," she said, and opened her hand again so he could see the silver in her palm. "But not in the way you think." The first man to reach the barn was not Owen, but Martha Mercer, apron still on, a shawl drawn tight over her shoulders against the night wind, her face set in that plain, practical way women wore when they had already decided they might have to tidy up a trouble before sunrise. Behind her came Owen, pale now with the full weight of what his loose words had begun, and after them 2 ranch hands from the bunk shed, both silent, both trying hard to look useful instead of curious. Wyatt stepped toward the doorway before any of them crossed the threshold. He did not block it in any theatrical way. He simply stood where a man stood when he knew the next few moments might harden into something that would not soften again for a long time. "She is resting," he said. Martha Mercer's eyes moved past him all the same. Women in hard country had learned to see around men when they needed the truth. Her gaze found Elira by the lantern, saw the blanket over her shoulders, the cup on the floor, the tired set of her body, and something in Martha's expression changed. Not into trust, not yet, but into caution of a better kind. "The boy says she was alone in here with you," Martha said. Wyatt heard no accusation in it, only the dangerous shape of a sentence that wanted finishing. "She was cold," he answered, "and hurt." Owen shifted beside Martha, shame and uncertainty fighting in his face. "I did not say you done wrong," he muttered. "I only said how it looked." Elira lifted her eyes then, and in the quiet of the barn those words seemed to hang heavier than any louder claim. How it looked. That was always enough for a town hungry to arrange itself into judges. One of the ranch hands, Caleb Ross, took off his hat and held it awkwardly at his side. "Folks in the bunk shed are talking," he said, "and not just about shelter." Wyatt turned his head a fraction toward him. "Then they can learn patience." Caleb gave the sort of half nod a man gave when he agreed in principle, but did not expect patience to survive the hour. Martha stepped 1 pace closer to the doorway and spoke directly to Elira, not to Wyatt. "Miss, do you want to come up to the house with me?" It was a decent offer, clean and plain. Elira looked at the woman for a long moment, and Wyatt sensed how much depended on what came next. "No house," Elira said softly. Martha did not flinch at the answer. She only studied the barn, the threshold, the 3 boards lit by lantern glow, and perhaps because she had lived long enough to know that refusals often carried a history with them, she did not press the matter. Instead, she noticed the silver button in Elira's hand. The older woman's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "That is a curious little thing to be holding in a place like this," she said. Wyatt saw Elira weigh whether to close her fist again, then decide against it. "It belonged to my mother," she said, "and this place belonged to a memory." Martha let that settle. The wind moved through the cracks in the siding, and from down by the bunk shed came the low rise and fall of voices no longer pretending not to speculate. A dog barked once, then stopped. Somewhere beyond the corrals, a coyote called thin across the dark. The whole ranch felt as if it had turned one ear toward the barn and was waiting to hear which way the story would lean. Martha looked at Wyatt. "Your father kept odd things," she said, so quietly that only those nearest the door would catch it. Wyatt met her eyes. "You remember this?" She nodded once. "I remember seeing a silver button in a cedar box after your mother passed. I remember asking no questions because your father had a face on him that day which told a sensible woman to leave a drawer shut." Owen stared at both of them, his young certainty crumbling by degrees. "Then this is about your father?" he asked, as if the dead might somehow be easier to accuse than the living. Elira answered before Wyatt could. "It is about what people keep hidden because they think silence is the same as peace." Nobody spoke after that. Even the horses seemed to listen. Then Caleb glanced out across the yard and said, "Company." Wyatt turned. Down by the east fence, where the moon laid a pale wash over the pasture and turned the wire silver, shapes had begun to gather. At first they looked like part of the land itself, dark and still, but then one horse lifted its head, and the faint shine of bridle leather caught the light. Riders. Not 1 or 2. More than a dozen, maybe close to 20, waiting just beyond the line where a man could pretend not to see. They did not call out. They did not advance. They sat their horses with the kind of patience that made hurried men nervous. Owen drew in a sharp breath. Caleb put his hat back on without seeming aware he had done it. Martha Mercer exhaled slowly through her nose and folded her hands before her apron as if bracing against bad weather. Elira did not even turn fully to look. She already knew who had come. Wyatt saw that truth in the stillness of her shoulders. "Are they with you?" he asked. "They came to find out whether I had found what I came for," she said. Owen looked from her to the riders and back again, and all the easy conclusions left his face at once. The talk from the bunk shed would spread faster now. By dawn it would not be a barn, a woman, and a cowboy. It would be a ranch ringed by Apache riders and a dead man's secret rising through the floorboards. Wyatt felt the old silver button, though it was not in his hand, like a weight already pulling on every loose board his father had left behind. Martha Mercer laid one hand on Owen's arm, not out of fear, but to keep him from bolting back toward the bunk. Shed with fresh panic in his mouth. "No one says another word until there is something true to say," she said. It was the firmest sentence spoken all night. But Wyatt knew truth had already come too close to stay quiet much longer. And in the lantern light, with the riders waiting beyond the fence and Elira standing inside the memory she had crossed miles to face, he understood that by morning the county would not be deciding only what kind of man he was. It would be forced to reckon with what kind of man his father had been, and what kind of silence this ranch had been living on for years. The riders stayed at the east fence like figures cut from the same dark cloth as the prairie itself, their horses quiet under them, their patience more unsettling than any shouted threat could have been. No one in the barn moved for a few seconds. Even Owen Mercer, who had spent the last hour learning how quickly a man could be made small by his own assumptions, kept still beside Martha, as if any sudden motion might crack the night in two. Wyatt stepped out from the barn doorway into the open yard, not far, only enough that he could see the line of horsemen clearly under the moon. The air had turned colder. It carried the sharp smell of trampled grass, dry cedar posts, and the faint, clean edge of water from the creek beyond the pasture. Behind him, the lantern in the barn cast a warm square of light across the threshold and stopped there, as though it too knew better than to chase this moment out into the dark. The riders did not cross the fence. That mattered. Wyatt knew enough about men, white and native alike, to understand that lines respected in silence often said more than words. One rider near the center sat a little ahead of the others, older than the rest by the look of his shoulders and the stillness of his seat. Moonlight touched the silver in his hair, and the edge of a dark blanket folded over one shoulder. He looked not at the house, not at the ranch hands gathering uncertainly near the bunk shed, but straight at Wyatt, as if measuring him against some account long left unsettled. Then his gaze shifted to the barn door. Elira stepped into view behind Wyatt, still wrapped in the wool blanket, her hand closed around the small silver button. The old rider inclined his head only once. It was not submission. It was recognition. And in that small movement the whole yard changed. The men by the bunk shed saw it too. Their fear had expected one kind of story, simple and sharp and easy to repeat in town by morning. But this was something else. Not a raid. Not revenge riding in hot blood. A waiting. A witnessing. Martha Mercer came down the 2 steps from the porch and walked out across the yard until she stood near Wyatt, one hand holding her shawl close at the throat. She had the kind of courage that never made a show of itself. It simply arrived where it was needed and stayed. "They are not here to rush the place," she said softly. Wyatt nodded. "No." From behind them came the creak of the front door and the cautious shuffle of more feet. Ranch hands. Cookhouse boys. One of the older cowhands with his suspenders hanging loose and his face half-shaved, called from his bed by rumor and moonlight. None of them came too close. Curiosity pulled them forward. Good sense kept them back. Elira stood in the barn light, but did not step into the yard. Wyatt noticed that and understood. She had crossed enough distance for one night. The old rider at the fence raised one hand, palm open, then lowered it. No command followed. No call. It was the kind of gesture meant for one person only, and Elira answered with the smallest nod. Owen looked from her to the riders and whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "They came for her." "No," Elira said from the doorway. "They came with me. There is a difference." The sentence drifted out over the yard and settled hard. Caleb Ross, standing near the water trough, shifted his weight and took off his hat again, though whether from respect or unease he likely could not have said. The moon had climbed higher now, laying pale light over the corrals, the wagon ruts, the roofline of the bunk shed, and the old cedar box of a memory Wyatt could feel opening wider in his mind. His father had never spoken of Apache riders at the fence. He had never spoken of silver buttons wrapped in red thread. He had never spoken of barns, or lines on the floor, or children who remembered rooms by smell before they remembered faces. Yet here they all were, standing in the same cold night, asking for an answer from a man already 6 years in the ground. Wyatt turned slightly toward Alira. "Do they know why you came?" he asked. "They know enough," she said. "They know my mother carried one truth all her life and gave it to me when she could no longer carry it herself." Martha looked at her then, not with suspicion now, but with the grave attention one woman gave another when pain had crossed too many miles to be dismissed as confusion. "And what truth is that?" she asked. Alira opened her hand. The silver button caught the lantern glow from the barn and flashed once, small as a star and twice as old. "That a man lived here who saw what others chose not to see," she said. "That he kept one piece of that night because he could not save all of it." No one answered. In the bunk shed doorway, somebody shifted and muttered something under his breath, but the sound died quickly. The old rider at the fence remained motionless, yet the line of men behind him seemed to settle deeper in their saddles, as if Alira's words had placed them exactly where they were meant to be. Wyatt felt the ranch around him in a new way then, not as land inherited and worked and mended through seasons, but as a place that had held a sealed room inside its own history. He thought of the old stall his father never used, the cedar box on the top shelf, the sudden silences that had once seemed to a boy like nothing more than weather passing through a man. The county had called his father stern, proud, fair, sometimes distant. It had never called him haunted. But haunted men often left the gentlest evidence. A locked drawer, an untouched corner of a barn, a keepsake too strange to belong to the life everyone else believed they knew. Martha Mercer was the first to step closer to Alira. She did not reach for the button. She only looked at it, then at the woman holding it. "If the truth belongs here," she said, "it ought to be spoken where folks can hear it straight." Wyatt understood what she meant. By morning, town talk would have him guilty of one thing or another, Alira guilty of something else, and the riders at the fence turned into whatever fear found easiest to describe. Truth told late always had to run uphill. Truth told now might at least start on level ground. Wyatt looked once more at the riders, at the old man in the center who had not pressed forward and had not left, and then back at the barn where Alira stood. "There is something in my father's room," he said slowly. "A cedar box. I have not opened it since he died." Alira's face changed only a little, but enough for him to see that this, more than the riders or the rumors or the moonlit fence, was the point the whole night had been leading toward. "Then open it," she said, "and let the dead stop hiding behind the living." Wyatt did not answer at once. He looked past Martha, past the yard silvered by moonlight, past the men half-dressed in work shirts and unease, and up toward the dark square of the second-floor window where his father's room had sat untouched except for dust and seasons. The house was not large, but in that moment it seemed to stand farther away than the east fence. He had slept under its roof his whole life, had hauled wood to its porch, had carried his father from its doorway to the wagon when fever took the old man at last, and still there were places inside it he had never truly entered. He took the lantern from the barn floor, the metal warm against his hand, and started uphill without telling anyone to follow. They followed anyway. Martha Mercer came first, steady as winter. Owen trailed behind her, his face pale and sober now, a young man meeting the hard edge of consequence. Caleb Ross and the other hands came no farther than the porch, but they stayed close enough to hear if the night chose to speak loud. Alira crossed the yard last. She moved carefully, favoring her leg, blanket drawn around her shoulders against the wind, the silver button held in one closed hand. She did not look toward the riders at the fence. She did not need to. Their waiting had become part of the dark itself. Inside the house the air was warmer, touched by coffee gone bitter on the stove, lamp oil, and the old clean smell of boards scrubbed over many years. Yet even there, Wyatt could feel the barn clinging to them in the dust on their boots and the silence in their throats. He led them down the narrow hall to the back room where his father had slept. The door had not been shut in months, but it still opened with the soft drag of wood against worn floorboards, as though the room resented interruption. The bed stood plain beneath a folded quilt. A washstand sat under the window. A Bible lay on the dresser with a pair of spectacles resting over it, just as Wyatt had left them after the funeral because moving them had felt too much like erasing the man. Nothing in the room announced a secret. That was the strange part. Hidden things almost never did. They waited inside ordinary objects and trusted people to keep calling them ordinary. Wyatt set the lantern on the dresser. Its light reached up the wall, brushed the cracked mirror, and threw a yellow half circle toward the top shelf of the wardrobe. He could see the cedar box from where he stood, tucked back in shadow behind a folded cavalry blanket and an old hat his father had quit wearing years before he died. For a moment he did not move. He felt again the way he had as a boy when he first spotted the box by accident and knew, without knowing why, that some things belonged to a father's silence more than to a son's curiosity. But boys became men, and dead men left their sons too many locked rooms if they were not careful. Wyatt reached up, brought the box down, and set it on the bed. Cedar breathed into the room at once, dry and sharp and clean, the scent of closets, trunks, and winters stored away. The box was not locked. It never had been. That, somehow, made it sadder. His father had not hidden it behind iron or key. He had hidden it behind respect, habit, and the belief that what a man did not name might stay buried. Wyatt lifted the lid. Inside lay the things he remembered, and one or two he did not. The broken watch chain, 2 old army buttons dark with age, a narrow strip of buckskin braided at one end, a folded paper yellowed along the creases, and there, tucked into the corner, another silver button wrapped in faded red thread. Martha Mercer drew in a small breath. Owen stared as if a ghost had taken shape in cedar and cloth. Elira did not move at all. She only opened her hand and held her button beside the one in the box. They matched so closely they might once have lived on the same garment. Wyatt looked from one to the other and felt the last of his doubt give way. Whatever this was, it had not begun tonight. It had been walking toward this room for years. He picked up the folded paper first. The edges had softened with handling long ago, then grown stiff with time. The writing on the outside was in his father's hand, square and steady, though the ink had browned with age. It bore no address. Just 3 words, if ever needed. Wyatt glanced at Elira before opening it. Her face was calm, but not empty. This was not revenge standing in his father's room. It was witness. He unfolded the paper slowly so the old creases would not split. The room listened. Even the porch behind them had gone quiet. In the lantern light the words rose one line at a time. The voice of a dead man finding its road back through ink. Wyatt read silently first, his jaw tightening not in anger, but in the strain of fitting a life he knew around truths it had not contained. His father wrote of a night during a storm season 22 years earlier, when a freight crew using the lower trail had been found sheltering near the creek with wagons that did not carry what their papers claimed. He wrote that among crates and tack and feed sacks there had been 2 Apache women and a small girl kept hidden from sight, to be moved farther south by men who traded in desperation wherever the law reached thin. He wrote that he had not been alone in finding them, but that the others with him had chosen not to make a public matter of it once the women and child were out and the wagons gone by dawn. He wrote that one woman was too weak to travel fast, that the child clung to a shawl sewn with silver buttons and red thread, and that he had taken one button when it tore loose in the barn because the mother had pressed it into his hand and said, in broken English, that a child who survived would need one day to know where the road had turned. Wyatt swallowed. The room seemed smaller now, tighter with all the years his father had carried alone. He kept reading. The letter said the child had lived. The younger woman too. The older one had been taken west with help before sunrise, and his father had chosen silence after because the town men involved would have denied, buried, or twisted the truth, and because the family needed distance more than testimony. At the end, written darker as though the pen had pressed harder, were the words that made Elira close her eyes. If the child ever returns grown and carrying the match to this button, believe her before you believe the county. Wyatt lowered the paper very slowly. No one spoke. Martha Mercer lifted a hand to her mouth. Owen looked as if the floor itself had moved beneath him. Elira stood with her blanket around her shoulders and one silver button in her palm. And at last the mystery of the 3 boards, the threshold, the riders waiting silent at the fence, all of it gathered into one sorrowful shape. Wyatt looked down at the letter again, then at her. You were the child, he said. Elira opened her eyes and met his gaze with the calm of someone who had carried a truth too long to tremble under it now. Yes, she said. And your father was the man my mother never forgot. For a long moment no one in the room seemed willing to breathe too deeply, as if the letter itself might scatter if the air shifted wrong. Wyatt kept the paper in both hands, the old crease pressing against his thumbs, and looked at the last line again because it had opened more than one truth at once. Believe her before you believe the county. That was not only a warning. It was an instruction handed from one man to another across 6 years of silence and 22 years of regret. Wyatt had grown up under his father's roof learning how to mend fences, read weather, judge a horse, and keep his word once it was given. He had not grown up knowing that a promise could be hidden inside a drawer and still wait to be honored. Martha Mercer was the first to move. She stepped closer to the bed and looked from the letter to Alira, then to the matching button in the cedar box. Her face, lined by sun and seasons and the thousands of plain decisions that made up a hard but decent life, softened in a way Wyatt had never quite seen before. Then your mother sent you here for truth, she said. Alira shook her head once. Not for truth alone. Her voice was tired but clear. For measure. Wyatt looked up. Measure of what? Alira's eyes settled on him, steady and direct. Whether the son of that man would do what the man himself did. Whether he would stand still when standing still cost him something. Owen Mercer lowered his gaze at once, as if those words had found him too. Caleb Ross shifted on the porch outside the door, and the floorboard under his boot answered with a dry creak that sounded loud in the hush. Everyone in that house understood now that the danger was not riders at the fence or whispers in the bunk shed. The danger was what people would choose once the easy story failed them. Easy stories had always fed a town better than difficult truths. A stranger woman in a barn. Apache riders at the fence. A rancher with something to explain. Folks could carry that kind of tale all the way to Sunday and still have room to season it. But a dead man's private courage, a child's memory, and a county's old willingness to look aside when looking closer might shame too many familiar faces. That kind of story people tried to kill with doubt before breakfast. Wyatt folded the letter carefully and laid it back in the cedar box, though not beneath anything this time. He let it sit on top where anyone could see it. Then he picked up the matching silver button from the box and held it beside the one in Alira's hand. Together they made more sense than either one alone. Broken things often did. My father kept his part, he said quietly, in the only way he thought would last. Alira watched him with that same grave calm. Your father carried memory, she said. That is not the same as carrying it into daylight. The sentence did not wound him because it was true. Wyatt felt its truth all the way through. His father had helped, hidden, preserved, and then gone silent. Maybe silence had spared lives then. Maybe it had also spared guilty men the trouble of facing what they had permitted near their own fields and roads. The old rider at the fence, the one waiting in patience under moonlight, had not come for revenge. Wyatt could see that now. He had come for the answer to a smaller and harder question. When truth finally knocked on a white man's door, would the door open all the way or only enough to ease a conscience? Martha turned toward the hall, toward the open front of the house where the porch boards held the boots of listening men. Then they all need to hear it now, she said. Not tomorrow when the tale has gone crooked. Owen looked stricken. Mrs. Mercer, town folk will say anything once they see the riders. They are already saying anything, she answered. What they are short on is the truth. Wyatt closed the cedar box and took the letter in his hand instead of putting it away. That was the choice. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just visible. He could almost feel his father standing somewhere behind the old room's silence, not asking to be praised, only asking not to be buried a second time under other people's cowardice. He turned to Alira. If I read this outside, before everyone, they will hear more than my father's words. They will hear what he never named about the men around him too. Men with sons. Men with grandsons. Men whose names still sit easy in town. Alira nodded. Yes. And once spoken, it does not go back in the box. No, she said. It does not. Wyatt looked at the letter once more, then toward the window where the moonlight silvered the edge of the sill. He had spent years guarding this ranch through drought, through bad cattle prices, through sickness and winter losses, believing stewardship meant holding the place together. Tonight he understood that sometimes holding a place together meant letting its prettiest lies come apart. He gave a single nod, more to himself than anyone. Then it gets read. Martha's chin lifted in approval. Owen straightened, ashamed and relieved in equal measure, as though a path had appeared where a thicket of rumor had been. Elira pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, not from fear now, but from the simple cold of a long night nearing its hardest hour. Together they moved back through the hall and out onto the porch. The yard below lay open under moonlight, the barn dark behind them, the east fence lined with waiting riders whose stillness had not changed. Men from the bunk shed stood scattered near the water trough and hitch rail, hats in hand or forgotten on heads, all of them carrying some version of the wrong story in their faces. When Wyatt stepped onto the top porch step with the letter visible in his hand, the murmurs thinned and then died. He felt every eye find him, then shift to Elira behind his shoulder, then drift to the riders at the fence. Caleb Ross was the first to speak. "Wyatt," he said, uncertain now. "Folks are saying this woman came here to accuse you." Wyatt looked out over them all, over the men who worked his land, over the woman who had walked miles to test what kind of man stood in his father's place, over the old rider beyond the fence who had trusted silence longer than most would have. Then Wyatt answered in a voice steady enough to carry to the yard, the porch, and the waiting dark beyond them. "No," he said. "She came here to find out whether this ranch still knows the difference between shame and truth."